year is 1959, and Fidel Castro has just become the 16th Prime Minister of Cuba. He is settling in for a run that's going to last 50 years, and at this point in time, women in Cuba are seen as second-rate citizens. They don't have the education that they need to get a good job. We live in a country where this doesn't seem to be an issue. Women have been getting a good education for decades, and the women of Cuba just seem to be starting. Women all over the world have made their mark on history. Women like Joan of Arc, Amelia Earhart, and today I will tell you about two women that made their mark on history to push their gender to the forefront in Cuba. Those two women are Celia Sanchez and Vilma Espin, and they fought for women's rights in Cuba to get a good education. And today, women in the government of Cuba play a huge role as well. So again, the year is 1959. Fidel Castro is now Prime Minister, and women are at the bottom of the totem pole. My first point is Celia Sanchez. She was a part of the Cuban Revolution, and was in the Cuban government with Fidel Castro as Prime Minister. She controlled military movements, and one of the things she did was she picked a boat on where it would land that carried guerrilla soldiers that participated in the military revolution from Mexico to Cuba, according to an article called Liberation School. She also started programs like for wildlife reserves and parks protection. But what she was really passionate on was literacy. In the article that I used on our discussion post 2 weeks ago, she started a program in 1961 when the literacy rate was 25%. By 1962, the literacy rate was in the 90s. She was a major drive in the revolution. She is revered throughout the country, and she was able to inspire the next generation to do some of the same things that she did. My next point is about a woman who had done something that nobody had ever done in the country before. Vilma Espin was a key cog in the government as well. In the article Ahorta, 66% of women are now a doctor, researcher, or an engineer, which was what she did for the government. And she was also the first woman in Cuba to ever hold a degree in that category. She was very passionate on gender equality and also racial equality, and discrimination against both could land you up to 2 years in prison. Along with Sanchez, who was a very good friend, her and Celia Sanchez were able to turn her home into a headquarters for the revolution. Cuba has changed since then. The U.S. embargo has been lifted. Americans can now travel there, and Fidel Castro obviously is no longer Prime Minister. Expectations are at a boiling point. A New York Times article states that Cuba is 18th out of 142 nations in women's political empowerment. They are also second in percentage of women in government, according to the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap from 2014. In comparison, the U.S. is 54th. My second point is Cuba and its GDP. A lot of countries put their GDP towards military along those lines. Cuba puts its towards education. In a 2015 World Bank article, Cuba gives 12.9% of its GDP to education. In comparison, again, the U.S. gives 5.5%. So back to the numbers. If it had not been for Celia Sanchez and Vilma Espin, none of this would have been possible for Cuba. So I hope the points that I gave you today leave you well informed on the Cuban education system and how it has become one of the best in the last 60 years. So to reinforce my thesis, women all across history have left their mark, and Celia Sanchez and Vilma Espin are two of the list's newest members. Sanchez was a trailblazer. She helped hundreds of thousands learn how to read and expand their minds. Espen was the first woman in the history of Cuba to have an engineering degree. It's now a top job in the country, and the amount of women in government in Cuba's education system is because of them. And still today, that message of a strong education is carried on in the country. The U.S. education system in 1960 was very good, and it still is today, but it seems that Cuba has passed us. Cuba has seen a lot of progress for once a hermit crab/communist nation that has a very shaky past. They have now become a world leader in education and a world leader in putting women in government.